especially in the last few years, as I've observed, there are big shifts going on in the larger social order, with movements of justice and equity coming to the foreground in ways that they really haven't in larger conversations and in policy. And at the same time, there's an equal and opposite pushback that things need to be maintained the way that they were. There's these seemingly polar dynamics going on, and people, you can sort of stratify them on one side or the other in one way or the other. But the reality that supersedes all of that is that all of these are happening in the level of concept and idea. And then beyond concepts and ideas, there is just this vast openness that we're all within this larger context, but the place from which we are actually experiencing ourselves is not determined by the way other people see us, but the way that we locate ourselves within these different layers. So when someone says something like, that's my truth, or this is your reality, that is a clear indication that they're operating from some place. For example, when someone takes a stance on something, they are taking a stand from some place against something else, which means they've already built in this sort of separateness into their framework of looking at something, and it becomes visible that way. So when you say there's definitely right and wrong, that is a framework, because certain things fall into one side of that and other things fall into the other. That's a conceptual framework. Beyond the conceptual framework, there's just things taking place. Everything's neutral. But most of us aren't living our lives from that neutral place. We're living our lives from this sort of container place. And then people associate their framework with truth. So the way I like to discuss this is that what people are really doing is they're demonstrating their conditioning, because people live through their conditioning. Like, I'm going to go metaphysical, and maybe this will be confusing, but I'm going to say it anyway. So the only thing that truly does exist beyond name and form, outside of all concepts, beyond time and space, is awareness. Awareness is not located anywhere. It's not particular to anything. It doesn't belong to some things and not things. It just is. Awareness is the cosmos experiencing itself. So that's ubiquitous. It's in everything, everywhere. In the context of yoga teachings, they would say that this is Brahman, right? The unmanifested, undifferentiated cosmic intelligence. So awareness. And then what we are is awareness in a particular form with particular kinds of conditioning. So we don't experience ourselves as a Brahman, as awareness itself. We experience ourselves as our conditioning, which you could say is, in the contextual framework of yoga, is the jiva, or the difference between jiva and paramatma, right? Or atma and paramatma. Atma is like that undifferentiated consciousness or awareness, and then paramatma, it's the other way around. Atma is like the differentiated version, paramatma is the undifferentiated, or jiva. So these are conditionings, right? So we know ourselves through our conditioning, and that's what we experience as our truth. For example, and this is a very basic example, if your neck was like this your whole life, and you saw the world at an angle like this, and you were always uncomfortable like this, that's the only way you'd know anything. And if someone came along to you and pointed out, like, your neck's kind of like this, and like, if you just tilt your head a little, you might see things differently, you would be totally resistant to that, because this is the way you've known everything. This is your framework. This is your point of view. This is how you know yourself. Your whole muscular system, your nervous system, your breathing is all focused and centered around things being this way. And then if it shifts, it's completely different. And that's a like gross demonstration of how conditioning influences the way we experience things. So when people talk about truth or right or wrong, they're showing us their conditioning. They're not showing us reality, the larger context of things. They're showing us the place from which they're seeing things, or the place from which they're experiencing things. And this is the other thing, is that experience is not reality. Experience is just a flavor of things, right? It's the way that your conditioning is flavoring your experience of something. And it is itself fleeting, because your conditioning can change. What you thought was harmful at one time could then be very helpful at another time. What has changed about the thing? Nothing. It's your conditioning that has changed. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that when people have these conversations that are very clearly couched in conceptual frameworks, if we don't examine the framework, then we can't arrive at a common understanding of what it is we're having a conversation about. We have to come to terms. And the difficulty is that all these spiritual things are super loaded. There's so much baggage in it, right? Like this word soul, there's so much baggage in the word soul. So, and it doesn't mean what we say it means. Our words are signifiers of something beyond ourselves. It's like a sign pointing at something. Like if you saw a sign that said Rocky Mountains 5 miles, would you say that the sign is the mountain? No, you wouldn't. You have to know what a mountain is. You have to know what miles are. You have to know what 5 is to really understand that sign. So there's all of these concepts built into everything constantly that we're just not acknowledging. And if we want to live in a world where people are free to experience life completely without endless amounts of struggle, we need to create frameworks that allow for people to experience themselves freely, which means you need to acknowledge people's conditioning. So instead of, this is the conceptual framework that we all need to operate in, and then you need to tailor your life into this framework, because that doesn't work. It should be the opposite. We need to learn ways to approach our own conditioning, to see them clearly, and then move into a place where we're having a collective conversation and we're collectively organizing life in a way that allows us all to experience our nature. That is a very different way of living life. That is not democratic, so to speak. That's not the framework that we're operating in currently. We're operating in like very shorthand, very deeply conditioned frameworks that don't really allow most people to experience freedom. And the folks who do experience that freedom are like, what are you all talking about? I'm free. They're not seeing how other people aren't experiencing the same kind of freedom that they are. Because how could they? If their neck is like this, how could they know that it's not straight? How could they know? And no matter how many times I will point out to someone, like, you're kind of tilted this way, they're not going to see it until they feel what they need to feel. When you can feel where you're holding, because you've relaxed enough to feel it, you feel the discomfort of that, then you can address it. And that's what's at the heart of all of these practices. The practices are helping us to engage with the discomfort of our conditioning. If we don't do that, our practices don't work for us. It's just like masturbation. You know, it might make you feel good for some time and you get a little high, but then you'll come back down and nothing has changed. It's a very different thing to have like a real deep, intimate relationship with something versus a little bit of a high and then come down. It's a very different thing.